Well, it really is good to be with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to share this morning. I also bring greetings to you from Joth Hunt, who is the newly appointed Regional Minister for the South Eastern Baptist Association. He says hello, and he says he's looking forward to meeting you in due course. He's hoping to move to Kent. He's stuck in one of those waiting for things to come together in terms of moving, but yeah, he will definitely be in touch. But he did ask me to bring you greetings. So we looked at that question, what are you waiting for? And I've been invited to pick up on the theme that you're running at the moment, looking at the book of Ezra and the story of the Exiles. And it's been great. I'm glad you have your sermons recorded, because I've been able to watch the last two, so I have a little bit of an idea of what's been happening so far. But to start with, I wanted to show you a photograph. This was our holiday just a few weeks ago. We are where we are. That's the phrase I'm going to come back to several times. But that is beautiful. This is Kotor in Montenegro. I don't know if you've been. It's absolutely beautiful. One of the most beautiful places we've ever been to. And we actually sailed in there. And it's lovely. And to be in that place just a few weeks ago was wonderful. But it wasn't perfect. Because unfortunately, there was supposed to be 8 of us going on this holiday. As I say, we've got my son and his girlfriend was coming, my daughter and her boyfriend, and neither of them had ever been on a cruise, so it was a bit of a treat. And we were all geared up for this. And then, unfortunately, our friends who were coming, because there's meant to be 8 of us going, got COVID at the beginning of the week before we left. And then the day after, my daughter caught COVID. And those are the plane seats. I told you needed tissues for this. Those are the plane seats, actually, that my daughter and her boyfriend would have been sitting in. You know, this was the holiday we've been looking forward to, but it wasn't what we wanted to happen. I said, I'm not leaving anyone. I was adamant, but actually the company said, sorry, if you're fit and well and you're testing negative, you have to go or you won't get your money back. So we were where we were, in a sense, but not where we wanted to be. The exiles were also in a situation where they were. They were not, and we pick it up in this chapter, not where they wanted to be. Things were not how they really wanted things to be or had anticipated when they had returned to Jerusalem. So last week, if you were here or you've picked up on the video, we were looking at Ezra chapter 3 and how the exiles came back ready to start the work. They managed to rebuild the altar, which was the central place, in a sense, for worship and meeting with God, so they got that right. And then they had laid the foundations. And as the foundations were laid, though some were sad because it was not as big as the previous, there was a lot of rejoicing. And there was a lot of noisy rejoicing going on because they were so thrilled to be back there and to be starting to rebuild the temple, which was the centre of worship for those Jewish people, and they'd been scattered to different places prior to that. So let's pick up at the beginning of Ezra chapter 4, and I'm going to read the first 5 verses. The enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were rebuilding a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel. I'm not sure that was rumours or whether they heard the worship, but they certainly heard, they knew something was going on. So they approached Zerubbabel and the other leaders and said, "Let us build with you, for we worship your God just as you do. We have sacrificed to him ever since King Esarhaddon of Syria brought us here." But Zerubbabel and Yeshua, the other leaders of Israel, replied, "You may have no part in this work. We alone will build the temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, just as King Cyrus of Persia commanded us to." Now, it's interesting because I'm really keen on partnership. And if I can partner with somebody else who wants to help me fulfill what we feel called to do, I'm like, yeah, that's great. But this comes almost as a warning, because Zerubbabel wasn't like, oh, great, yeah, let's have a little bit more workers, we'll get this done better. He knew that though they claimed to worship God, Yahweh, and they did, they also worshipped a number of other gods. And that then getting them involved in something that was so central to Jewish worship would have been a compromise on the values, would have been a letting go of the holiness that God had called his people to. So it was a warning here, and Zerubbabel picked that up. So despite, having the opportunity for partnership, there was something here where he recognized, no, that would be a compromise. And so for us, as we partner with others or look for opportunities as a church, we might partner with other agencies. And certainly in Ebbsfleet, we use every opportunity we can when we can. But my question is always, does this in any way compromise who God has called us to be and the mission he has called us to do? Because if it does, it's not for us. And I think that's a really important thing. And Zerubbabel picked that up. Interestingly, the group of people here are later known as the Samaritans in the New Testament when Jesus talks about them. So let's continue in that chapter from verse 4. Then the local residents tried to discourage and frighten the people of Judah to keep them from their work. They bribed agents to work against them and to frustrate their plans. This went on during the entire reign of King Cyrus of Persia and lasted until King Darius of Persia took the throne. So they were discouraged, they were afraid. But let's not be harsh on them, because we can read this and say, oh, come on, you've got Cyrus behind you, you've got God with you. Why did you give up? But, actually, these were serious threats. And what follows through the chapter is another kind of a record of letters that were written by the leaders of that time to the Persian authorities, saying how terrible the Jewish people were and how he couldn't trust them, and how if they got power or a footing in the area, suddenly money would be lost from the treasury. It was very political, interestingly. There was all of this opposition, and it was very real, and it was threatening. And it actually hindered the work for 16 years. It's quite a long time, isn't it? From that moment of celebration at the end, we see of chapter 3, suddenly they're thrown into this turmoil where they can't continue the work. Do you know, you can be doing exactly what God asks, but that doesn't mean that you won't face opposition and challenges. In fact, it's probably true to say that if you are doing exactly what God asks and wants, then the enemy, the devil, is very keen to hinder you in whatever way he can. And often that's the place of strongest spiritual opposition, and sometimes opposition to other things and in different ways. Paul writes in one of his letters to the Corinthians that we fight not against flesh and blood. And he talks about the armour of God that we need to put on in Ephesians. The enemy will do what he can to oppose us. But, it doesn't mean that we're not exactly where God wants us to be. This next slide is my part of our nativity set. Now, this is not to scare you. We are not on the countdown to Christmas yet. Although maybe you are, I don't know. did put it in my diary, actually, because we always leave Christmas planning in Ebbsfleet a little bit late. So it is in my August diary to start applying for some funding for what we want to do. But I'm showing you that because back in 2019, I was preparing the talks for our Sunday Active sort of spiritual talks, and it was Advent, and I thought, okay, what I'll do is I'll look at all the different characters and I'll see what advice would they give us for today. So I started with Mary and Joseph, and as I was preparing it, I was thinking about, the events leading up to it, and then the fact that Mary was about to give birth and they had to go to Bethlehem. I thought, there was no couple at that point more in the centre of God's plans. But it couldn't have felt more out of control. Can you imagine? And as I prepared that, and as I thought about that, I felt God say, Penny, this is a word for you and Barry. And we shared it, and I thought, because we were getting to that point where we were wondering if we should move to Ebbsfleet. And I felt really strongly, God said, yes, the next year is going to feel very unsettling, very challenging, very difficult, and at times, like I am not in control, but you need to trust me. Well, that's not the kind of thing you want to hear, really, is it? So we did put our house on the market, and it did turn out that the next year, and I showed some foundations earlier, the foundations I showed were not obviously of the temple, they were modern foundations, and they were foundations actually of our house. which is our house now, plot 100. But actually, it was a nightmare in terms of the practical things. We had to sell a house. To buy a brand new house, you have to reserve it, but you first have to be offered it. This was a unique house because it has a studio space over the double garage. So this space, and it was the only house, I think, that David Wilson Homes had built in the southeast like this, but certainly it was the only one in Ebbsfleet. So we were on the list, but we knew we weren't top of the list. So we had to sell our house praying that we would get it. And the sales office wouldn't commit to anything, but they were kind of very warm. They were encouraging us, weren't they, Barry, to kind of keep going. But we didn't know. When they finally offered us it, we unfortunately didn't have a buyer that wasn't in a chain, and so South Eastern Baptist Association stepped in, took a loan and reserved it for us. Thankfully, we were then able to take that back. Then the build got delayed. I'm not going through the whole story because that's a very long one, but the build got delayed, so we had to move for 2 months into temporary accommodation. We don't have a church building, so all the church staff, everything came with us. And then the building got delayed again, so we had to do a part move. And yes, eventually we were. And God said also through that time that we were to hold our nerve, which is not a phrase I use very often. And certainly when we were talking to the bank for the mortgage we'd been promised and suddenly things started changing, we had to hold our nerve. Words that God gave us. And it's encouraging when God kind of warns us and lets us know. The Exiles have been through such a roller coaster that they should have known that God was with them, even though the circumstances were not the same and not ideal. And I wonder if you find yourself in a situation where you're saying, well, not where I want to be, but we are where we are. Similar to Ebbsfleet, this time last year, we had about 8 couples meeting on Zoom. I'm thinking, gosh, this is the best it has been. This is really exciting. And then you may know Nat and Stacey. Nat was a trainee minister with us. He's moved on. And various people on the team said, for different reasons, we feel God's calling us to something else. And so we started this year with a fragile team of 8. And one of those has health issues at the moment ongoing. Not where I want to be. Fragile, but we are where we are. And it's an opportunity for God to do something. When we are weak and vulnerable, it's an opportunity for God to step in. So, I was like, right, I kept looking back at this chapter. I'm thinking, what is there here in this chapter that I can say, this is the good news, this is what happened, this is how they got out of this situation. But I wasn't given chapter 5, and I don't want to spoil it for next week. And I don't know, like you, I found in lockdown, I actually discovered where Netflix is. And if you're like me, I love watching, series, and you know how you used to have to wait till next week, or leave it on a cliffhanger. Now you think, I'll just watch this episode. It leaves it on a cliffhanger. I'm going, I can't go to bed now. I need to know what happened. So, I end up watching at least the first 10 minutes of the next episode before I then leave it. We can find out quite quickly, can't we? We can follow stories through quite quickly. But actually, we are left in this chapter in that 16 years of nothing much happening, of opposition, of letdown, of disappointment. But the opposite of fear and discouragement is faith and hope. And I hope that for those people, there was still something of their faith in God that kept alight, that kept them going. They did not lose. They would have still used the altar for worship. And though I can't find anything particular in that chapter at the moment that takes us beyond that, and that is sometimes how life is, I did want to look wider at Scripture. And so my mind was taken to Hebrews 13, which begins that chapter with an encouragement of faith and a description of what that is. It says, faith shows the reality of what we hope for. It is the evidence of things we cannot see. Through faith, the people in the days of old earned a good reputation. That's from the New Living Translation. It shows the reality of what we hope for. These people had to hang in a place of faith. They had a vision, they had something they wanted to do, but it wasn't going to happen immediately. And That's what faith is. That's what hope is. A focus on God, a holding on to the promises of God, even though the circumstances are not exactly what we want. And then through Hebrews 11, the writer takes us through and he mentions different heroes of the faith, Noah and Abraham. And we're going to be looking at those actually with the children in the coming weeks. All of those things that God did. But interestingly, in verse 13 of chapter 11, it said, all these people died still believing what God had promised them. They did not receive what was promised in their lifetime, but they saw it all from a distance and they welcomed it. I hadn't noticed that before. You know, I look at that list and I think, yeah, they achieved amazing things for God and they saw it all and these were the giants of the faith. But actually for some of them, they stepped out in faith, they led, they obeyed God, but they didn't see it fulfilled in their lifetime. Interesting, isn't it? And then it goes on to other examples through that chapter. And I've suggested, if you wanted to do some further reading, that you might want to look at that chapter again and see who's in there and how they lived out their faith in difficult situations. I also mentioned a book, which is on your further thought, Running with Giants. It's John Maxwell. It's a really easy read, actually. It's quite good, and it's still available, I know, on Kindle at least. It basically takes some of those giants of the faith and imagines they're running around a stadium, and whilst they're running, they sort of stop to pause and to say what they've learned in their journey. So it's a good, encouraging book if you get time. Nice summer read that I wanted to mention, but you might want to spend a little bit more time. But I think what each of them had in common, and I guess what we need to do, is to change our focus. Because if we focus on the circumstances that we're often in, then we see things very differently. And you're probably not like me, but I am tempted to have a pity party every so often and get a bit despondent and a bit negative. And if the focus is on what we haven't got and the way things are not going well, then we lose the opportunity for God to do something great, for God to do a miracle. Because every problem, every situation, every struggle is an opportunity for God to intervene. Every reminder that we are fragile and that things aren't perfect is a reminder that we need God. And I've made this personal. I've talked about us as a church. I've talked about the people of Israel. But actually, as a nation right now, things are not perfect. We're in difficult situations. There's a lot of people who are going to struggle in the coming 12 months and beyond. And it needs to bring us back to God in prayer, for that faith and that hope, to know that God's kingdom is something greater and God's love will not change. And so we need to change our focus not from the problems and onto God, to what he can do, and to trust in him. So what are you thinking? Where are you at this morning? Is there a circumstance that you could be thinking, actually, yeah, I am where I am, but I'd rather not be here. I'd rather not be in this situation. Are you struggling to wait for something? 16 years was a long time before others came to encourage and to build them up. Be patient in that waiting. Know that if God's promised, he will be faithful, and we can trust in him. And remember that God is with us in those things. Jesus' final recorded words to his disciples included, you will have trouble and you have struggles, but as you go out, know, I am with you always. And sometimes in those harder moments that we discover God's love in greater measure than we have before, if we lean into him. And if we lean in and ask others to stand with us as well. We were never created to cope with life on our own. We are part of a family of God. So, again, if you're struggling on your own and you haven't shared, can I encourage you to find someone you know and trust to say, would you just pray for me? At the moment, life is particularly hard, and I just want to be able to be faithful to God in this as I go through it. And maybe you want to pray for God to change the circumstances. Maybe that can't change at the moment, but don't stand alone in this. Allow God to touch you, to encourage you. And find God in the situation that you are in now, because he is there and he's with you. And he never left the exiles during this 16 years as they waited between the amazing celebration of the foundation started in the altar and then the work continuing. Next week you'll find out the next bit of the story, but I'm not going to spoil that for you. But I just want to leave you with this from, again, Hebrews 12. So again, the writer has described all these amazing characters that we can read about and how their faith held through difficult situations. And then he says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. It's great, isn't it? The writer of this recognizes that actually we do get hindered by things that hold us back, by our sin, by maybe our lack of faith in God, those things, but he says, let's throw those things off and let's run with perseverance the race marked out for us. I don't just say that because I'm a runner. But notice it's a race marked out for us. It's a personal race. Your calling, your purpose that God has for you is different to the calling he has for me or the person next to you. Discover that. Then run with perseverance. Keep moving forward. You don't have to be fast to run. But fix your eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of your faith. It's back to that focus on Jesus, who shared our humanity, who sat and talked and listened and spent time with people who were in pain and struggled, who felt the pain of being human, who can stand alongside us. Consider him, fix our eyes on him again, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners for us because he loves us, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. So we'll leave us really in that limbo, in that place of, with the exiles, not quite where we want to be, but with a confidence that God is with us, that every difficult situation is an opportunity for God to act and to do something amazing. Let's commit ourselves to fixing our focus on God and allowing him to work and surprise us.